So I'm so happy to have this fantastic dialogue with Rebecca Armstrong and George Viney.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank you, George.
Our topic tonight is Schism and Converging Perspectives.
And as we pour the wine at the beginning, it seems to me that part of the healing of any schism that comes up is to evoke Dionysus.
Ah, indeed.
Right?
Celebrate.
Right. In vino verite, and our task tonight, should we choose to accept it, is to discover that verite verily in the wine.
It is very nice.
Very.
And see, already I slip into the accent of Rafael Lopez Pedraza, who you've never heard. I
Recognize the accent right away.
that I imitate all the time in honor to him, because I think he was another one who very much served the healing of any schism, whether in the person sitting in front of him or even in the Jung Institute in Venezuela. I remember he once said that people who were trying to create an institute in Caracas were coming to him and saying, would you please come and join us? We're going to meet and talk about it. And he would say he wouldn't do that if anybody that wanted to become part of that would like to talk to him about it. Please join him in his home one-on-one, because he felt that the moment he went into that collective, he was very wary of, would power grip it?
Yes.
And then the politics of it start to come up. And so I think he was just emphasizing that the starting point best happens in that individual eros that can happen if it's a small gathering, say 1, 2,
Right.
3 maybe.
Because you're not self-aware and like thinking about what other people are thinking of you,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because as long as it's kept intimate, it's about relationship.
Yeah.
With real
Yes.
people,
Yes.
not with ideas.
Right.
It's relating to somebody.
Yeah.
The minute it's an institution, it's theories, relating to power structures, relating to schisms.
Yeah.
Because the minute you have an institution, you have the possibility, and in fact, probably the inevitability of a schism.
Absolutely.
I know almost no institution that has not had major schisms of some sort.
Yeah.
We were just reading about a new Christian religion in
A
Mexico.
Christian sect, yes.
Is itself a new schism and has had a schism within already
Right.
by the when
In its
50s,
first,
the
right,
30s?
in its first 50 years, a major
Yeah.
schism. But all the schisms that we have perceived, and this, speaking theologically now, I'm not sure this is true, but maybe we can amplify this. The way I read it is that schisms occur when one group of people feels somehow satiated, that there's a fullness, and it's time to say, that's the end of Revelation. All that has been revealed, now we've got a canon, and we can put a frame around it. But then there's another group that's still somehow in movement, in process. They don't want to end. It's like, no. We want more of this. Revelation goes on. And that's the parting of the ways.
And my thought is that possibly that the reason for those people seizing up and saying, this is it, we don't want any more preachers, we don't want any new ideas, are people who literally are older and their brains have just stopped growing new synapses. Like, they literally just like, no more. They just stop.
Right.
And all the younger people are like, well, wait a minute, I want new stuff. It's a good metaphor at the very least, whether that's true or not.
Yeah. I remember, and it often comes to mind, I'm having two thoughts. One is in therapy hours, I work with a lot of Latino moms, and they'll tell me. One told me that she had joined a church and had become part of many committees, like 5 committees, and then the moment she, due to some very difficult circumstances, had to divorce, everybody distanced themselves from her and removed her from the committees and this and that. And that led to a conversation about how people get contained in a church or any system, and that containment affords them great meaning for their lives. And so everybody, ay hermana, dear brother, ay sister, this kind of thing, and they learn what the group's appropriateness is, what rituals, gestures, attitudes one must take. They take it, and the response they get from the church is, "You're one of us," and it can be in any system. But here was a woman who was called really to find her unique process, which in this case required her having to leave the identification and containment in that group, which leads me to Jung's experience of seeing God defecate on his church, the Church of Basel, and then realizing, what am I supposed to do? I've just had this vision. He seems to not be happy with that church anymore. Therefore, if I'm to be true to that vision, I must leave and find where the well is bubbling up again.
Right.
And
where the new revelation is still continuing. Right. And that's the key, because the way you've described the belongingness and the containment as mi hermana, mi hermos, it is in the role that you play. So that the price for being part of a contained institution is to sacrifice your own dynamic changing of personality. That would be way too unsettling for a contained institution. As long as you are willing to play the role, you're accepted and rewarded for that role. And that's the danger, I think, which is why so many individuals have to have schism from the institutions, whether it's the marriage or the church or the place that they've been working in, because the role becomes so rigid that they can't break out to breathe, for the soul to breathe.
Well, and the very nature of spirituality is an individual process. So if you're you're seeking any sort of spirituality, the religion is inherently going to stifle you. If it's been around for 5 years since the original cult leader has passed, within 5 years you've got institutionalized. Within 1 day you've had institutionalized version of the religion. Once the original guru, every original guru basically is teaching people, think for yourself. Listen to the internal spirit talking to you. Be inclusive. Everyone has value. And then as soon as that person's gone, they reverse the entire thing. It's inverted. And it's like, oh, believe what I say or you're not in the group anymore. Nobody who doesn't get our truth is chosen. They're all out, and they're all losers, and they're all going to die and go to hell. Or some version there of a lesser heaven, and stop thinking for yourself, for God's sakes. That's annoying me, and creating a schism,
and dangerous. Dangerous for the success of our institution.
Right, and this is success of the institution. It becomes the new God of the institution. How? Because success egoically, and this is the whole stemming of the problem. I think is the egoic mind, which just takes over the religion. The most really good prophets, no one's egoless. I'm sure Jesus had egoic moments where he's like, you son of a
damn fig tree.
But most great prophets are able to take on the higher mindedness and not let their ego run the whole show. And so
to be a conduit.
Right, to be a conduit. And so then they're bringing in this truth, and they're just pulling in truth all the time. Like people are just munching it up. They're like, oh my God, this is so great. I've never had such a powerful spiritual experience. So as soon as that person leaves, other human egos take over. And most people are not as gifted at restraining their egos as the prophet. And they can't help suddenly going, oh, well, now we have to systematize this. Now my ego wants to take control and tell people how things are going to be. And, oh my God, don't do that. That could,
and it's
that could
always
ruin
in
it.
the name of purity, which is interesting, right? The purists of any tribe are those who feel called to protect the original vision, the original mission, and they will fight to the death to preserve purity, as if there is something inherently important about purity when it comes to information, which is already a curious fantasy.
Lopez has a lovely article on that, on sectarianism, and when we would sit and talk about this, he would bring that up, that whether it's vegetarianism, it's any time you're in an ism, schism, then he really feels that's Artemisian. It's in the sort of the realm of Artemis, which is this purity, the virginal, all of that. It contains one's madness. So people go into it by taking out the contaminants, the perceived contaminants, right?
Precisely.
And that purity then isolates you, but contains you. And as you were talking, I think probably the best example for me of this that is worth pondering over, doing sort of Lectio Divina with Dostoevsky's section of the Grand Inquisitor. And I saw it performed by, blanking on the actor's name, directed by Peter Brooks here at the Broad Stage in Los Angeles. And he just had his, he had a music stand, the actor, he was dressed casually, and he was basically sort of reading it. But I think that minimalist thing brought out what was happening, which is that Jesus has returned and was walking through a plaza in the Middle Ages during the time of the Inquisition, and he starts performing miracles because people are coming to him. And then the Grand Inquisitor orders that he be arrested, and then he's taken up into a tower, and at midnight the Inquisitor comes in to have a conversation one-on-one with him. And he starts saying, basically, the most eloquent discussion of how you left us in charge. You did your thing, and now the people are happy with, they just want the miracle. They don't want to, it's very difficult to take up that individual path that Jesus, like you said, any prophet, that Jesus was asking you to drop your nets and follow me, right? And so he goes, they don't really want it. So we, the ones you left in charge, are dispensing the miracle and feeding the masses and giving them what they want, and they are fine. And then the actor delivered it so well, and I don't see that translation often in English. Why did you come to disturb us? And he comes back to it each time. We have it.
Which is now the second coming. The second coming everybody's waiting for is going to happen exactly the same way every time. Like, why are you disturbing us?
Yes,
Exactly.
we have it down. Right. They're happy. They're asleep. They're contained. Right. Why did you come to disturb us? Yes. And at the very end, in that most mysterious of responses, he did not speak the entire time, that is Jesus, and he kisses him on the cheek. His answer is a kiss, which leaves you to contemplate perhaps the healing of any schism, and all of that, again, is eros. It's where love shows up again.
But it's also the kiss of Judas. It's always the betrayal. The disturber is the betrayal, and the one who will not be disturbed betrays the original mission. So in the moment of eros, they are betraying each other as well, as it must be. As it must be. Betraying
perhaps the ego again. Right? Because in that betrayal, you're going back towards this authorization or connection with the Godhead.
Now, is that universal across other faiths as well? Or is it just
no, I was
Jesus
picking
story?
up on the Judas
story. Right.
and the kiss that signals he is the one to be taken.
And you have to add, because I'm sure this is where you're coming from, it's the Judas consciousness portrayed in The Last Temptation of Christ. Yes. Katsunsaki's sense of Judas, which is a very conscious Judas that loved Jesus so much that he's capable of betraying.
I will instigate this. Your final act, your greatest moment.
Yes.
Someone must set it in motion.
Which Jung then had to take up when he saw the shedding. It's excuse me. I know shedding. But we're shedding. Shedding.
The shatting.
The letting loose of what needs to be dispatched. But we need to speak in Dionysian terms. It can't all be ethereal, intellectual talk, or we have to get down into the bodily, dispatching.
Yes.
But that he has this vision, and he needs to be true to that vision, and disturb,
and
betray his father. who was a
Yes.
pastor, and
Right.
that
The whole
religion that was
lineage.
inherited.
And
Right,
so
right,
by
right,
turning
right.
away from the church, by saying there's a new message, a deeper message, it was a horrific betrayal. You can feel the tension and the suffering of his schism from his inherited
Right.
treasure.
And in my conversations with my wife Anahit, who's here in spirit, as she was individuating out of sort of the Armenian culture, and we took up these kinds of conversations based on dreams, it is the one who possibly, if it's being done with that kind of call to consciousness, the one who leaves, who disturbs, who betrays, and then the community, whatever community it is, thinks you've betrayed them. It's sort of the hero's journey. You actually set out to have the burning bush experience. You encounter the God, and then you are actually then possibly in the position to be the one who takes the culture even more deeply back to its living tradition and roots. So you end up being the most deeply loyal to the spirit, the living
Yes.
spirit of any group, having the courage to leave when you need to, find the source, the root, the originating experiences. Again, the burning bush, any of those
Spirit.
those miraculous epiphanies that happen every night in your dreams, if you're tracking them, and returning with that vision in an act of love. A friend of mine loves Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and that's all about Jonathan the
Right.
seagull leaving
Yes.
the
one-
flock,
the one
and the flock
ostracized.
attacking,
Yeah.
and then returning to some extent to really serve. You know,
Richard Bach,
yeah.
former Christian Scientist.
Was he really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
His books have had more relationship with synchronicity in my life.
Yeah. And probably have touched more people than Mary Baker Eddy's book at this generation.
Wow, that's a great
So in other
point.
words, that's a very good illustration
That's a great illustration.
of the new wine. That there was something that needed to be said that couldn't be said in the old way.
Now, this is a wonderful example of what the power of schism. Because when you have people shooting off, and Richard Bach, I don't believe he remained a Christian Scientist, but yeah, so he's birthing his own movement. Joel Goldsmith, who was a Christian Scientist for at least a
okay.
decade, and a teacher of Christian Science before he left, and then became the most prolific Christian mystic of the American tradition.
And the founders of the Unity Church, the Fillmores, were originally students of Mary Baker Eddy.
Yeah,
So that's another...
So the schisms off of the Christian Science movement, and now we have the New Thought movement, which is largely influenced. Has a lot of influence from it. It doesn't owe its entire lineage or anything, but all these other, and then you have people like the great puppeteer.
Henson?
Jim Henson, who is a former Christian Scientist, who does these amazing things for kids that is not by any means theologically oriented or any teaching any religious tradition, but again is just like these expansive ideas like the dark crystal, that are giving light in new and multifarious forms.
That's a wonderful movie to bring up because it has the converging perspective dynamic.
Oh, it's such a gorgeous
The one people who moved in different directions. Wasn't that it?
Yes,
There was one
which is
race.
schism. The mystics, the dark
and the
crystal.
dark crystal.
It's been
An
years since I've
early
seen that.
Jim
Yeah,
Henson.
So you have the mystics and the Skeksis, and they are the Skeksis are the dark political overlords of the world now. They
who became militaristic. Who
and
took
they have
the
these-
energy of Mars, the warrior.
and they have these sharp beaks, and they basically you have these robotic beetle creatures that do their bidding, and everyone in the whole world is scared of them basically, and they're like,
but they're brilliant and technologically savvy.
right. They've got all these weapons and stuff, and just they rule the whole world. The mystics, and there's an equal number of them at all times. If a mystic dies, a Skeksis dies. And the mystics have all gone out into the mountains, and they hide in these caves,
Hermetic
and there's like,
meditators.
and they sing like monks, and they when they pass on, there's like a white light. When the Skeksis pass on, their bodies crumble into dust. And at the end of this movie, sorry to spoil it for everybody else, at the end of the movie, the mystics come to the castle of the Skeksis.
Because the entire planet is threatened.
Because the Skeksis are about to get this at the right timing. They're going to complete the dark crystal, and get with the last shard, the secret shard that's missing, and the light's gonna come in, and they're gonna get all the power and suddenly be super, immortals basically on Earth. Well, the mystics show up, and when the light hits the crystal, and they're all oming, singing their song, the Skeksis and the mystics unite and become one once again, which is the original schism. That they're basically bringing it back together. It's like Big Bang, back together as one.
Yeah.
Gorgeous film, and it's a kids movie with puppets.
Yeah.
But in a sense, it's hinting at the deep dysfunction of 2,000 years of Christianity, where Christians are supposed to identify only with the ethereal, beautiful, spiritualized, pure side of the self.
Sure.
So that the dark self is forced into these power plays and manipulations, only can be a disturber and hunger for its moment on the stage. So in that sense, there's this constant yearning for unification from within. But until we acknowledge the schism as something which is both painful and necessary, and maybe even redefine it. Because schism, you say schism and you feel this knee-jerk reaction that you want to bring something together. Hillman's point is, don't do that. You're falling into a trap if you think every schism immediately needs to be joined. That's it's a false, that's like the mother-child, it's a fantasy. What if you just stood in the suffering place of being schizoid and evolved a way of communing among the parts of the self or the body politic? This would be a truer vision of how things really are, which is unity in diversity rather than true unification, which is kind of a false melding and melting.
True unification, like the origins of the Catholic Church, and how sort of to alienate most of our audience, but the origins of the Catholic Church really beginning with the Council of Nicaea, where Constantine had just spent the first 20 years of his reign militarily reuniting the Roman Empire, which had split into four quadrants. As soon as he's got it unified, he's like, we got to keep this unified. I'm going to pick this religion. Unfortunately, Christianity had already schismed. There were already two sects of the early Christian church, one that believed Jesus was God incarnate, the other that did not. And in order to reconcile that, he said, the priests are going to vote. Whichever the answer is, that's the answer, and everyone else died. Everyone else was either had to leave the Roman Empire or they were dead, and that's exactly what happened. And then the Council of Nicaea became law, and then the Roman Catholic Church, through many different methods, is the most successful human institution in world history. 1,700 years it has reigned.
By excommunicating those who have a different
by stopping schism, by reining it in. But the thing is that every schism is like a beautiful rainbow bursting forth of new inspiration, of the new prophets that they're trying to hold in. Stop the newness.
For those who don't know, the fellow is Rafael Lopez Pedraza, and he wrote this book, Hermes and His Children, which was about Hermes being sort of the patron god, poetically speaking, or archetypally speaking, of therapy. And he was saying that one day we were talking, and then he writes about it a bit in the book, which then led me to really be tracking this particular thought process. He talked about monotheism versus polytheism, right? And then the group, which was, they considered themselves, what was it called? A counter-education group. It was a group that was privately meeting, including Hillman and Lopez and Valerie, his wife, and et cetera, and a number of the Jungians there in training, to talk about things that were not being officially taught in the program. So they were studying a thing called the Picatrix, which is a magical document and a sacred ancient magical document about how to make magical talismans, but according to the different gods and goddesses. And as they were doing this, all sorts of synchronicities started happening that really moved them very much, which led him to think that, and develop this idea that in the psyche has this tension of monotheism, polytheism, one God, and the many gods, archetypally speaking. Thank you.
Yes.
And each god and goddess, poetically speaking again, appears with its own unique rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're sitting as a therapist with someone, you're trying to see, poetically speaking, what are they a child of? Which gods are they a child of? Is the person
yes.
Hermetic? Are they primarily
Right.
Titanic? Are they very martial or Mars related? Are they, choleric and angry and this and that? And Priapic, like he goes all through what is Priapus, who was a son of Hermes. That was a very odd mythological image, a big belly, holding his tunic up so that he had fruit in it, and with an erection to the rear. A very odd, embodied, physical god. And that god presented with its own unique, blunt, funny rhetoric. And also there was often like an inflating of the member and a deflating, a pruning back. So he was the god of the gardens. You prune
Wow.
and you cultivate, and it's fruitful.
And that it would be sexually and egoically as well.
Yes. And so Fellini's Satyricon goes, the main character is the son of Priapus. And so one can watch the rhetoric of a child or a psychology, according to Priapus, or a psychology that's Hermetic, which is more where I feel I fall, and perhaps a bit of Dionysus. And then, every time you're sitting with someone, you're trying to see, and usually the problems that are bringing them in is that they have, say, a Christian side or a monotheistic side, or they are, the cultural dominants are Apollinian, very rational, up in the head, and disconnected from these other gods, the most repressed being Dionysus, Aphrodite, Hermes, and their children, like Priapus or Pan. And so these gods grip the stage, come up in the psyche, and you have to detect. But if somebody comes in as a Christian or Apollinian, you have to speak within their rhetoric. And you had mentioned earlier that the essence of Hillman's schism is calling on Hermes, which Lopez was doing the same. That somebody comes in and they're in a schism, they're disconnected or they're isolated, and life at that moment or the situations they find themselves in must be in movement towards something else or something new. And Hermes is the one who can negotiate between all the gods as the messenger, providing that connection making so that you can connect with that's very strange or something that's very distant from where your ego is identified. So his suggestion is that Jungian psychology and archetypal psychology, which has been extended out by Hillman and others, is to cultivate a rich imagination with all the different kinds of rhetoric,
Yes.
and know how to connect between them. And then there's this guy, Michael Ceres, who is a philosopher, and he also articulates this thing of Hermes, that you can't have a unified vision where the same rhetoric is applied across all terrain, the world geographies and the psyche geographies, but rather you have to know how to move from one to the other and enter the different speech, the different imagining, the different memorial things.
So Hermes is like the great translator
Yes.
for the gods, so that when a schism happens, it doesn't separate into war factions.
Yes.
Everybody who has
Right.
a different viewpoint. Hermes is the converger of perspectives. He says, okay, I can't break you away from your perspective, but I can weave our perspectives together. I can communicate, translate from you to you to you to you, so that we can actually still work together.
So you see, when Lopez says, "Come to my home and let's talk," he's pulling the person who might be caught in group consciousness out of that, so that perhaps he can find what moves their psyches. The way we're just trying to find not where we polarize, but what connections we can make
Right.
that keep our psyche in movement. Because when it stops moving, that's when the stagnation happens, which yoga is always trying to break up, so that there's your life keeps in movement. Maybe not getting to some place in particular, but flowing, following the Tao, staying where because something got stuck.
Keeping your brain synapses growing.
Yes.
So that your brain doesn't just suddenly seize up. And then you die 5 years after retirement.
But we seem to be caught right now in this country with kind of an infatuation over fanning the flames of polarization.
Oh, yeah.
As if pushing the schism as far as it will go is actually somehow forwarding the motion of history. And this makes me think, of course, of Hegel's famous dialectic, that history is the result of these sort of swinging moods and theories that go from one antagonism or polarity to another. And I want to introduce another character into our conversation, who is this extraordinary woman from the turn of the century by the name of Jane Addams, the founder of Hull House and mother of the entire concept of social work and of living among those whom you would serve. There is a little-known conversation that Jane Addams had with John Dewey, the John Dewey, in Chicago while they were both working there at the University of Chicago. We only know about the conversation because John Dewey wrote a long letter to his wife the next day in which he describes the entire conversation. They were discussing the Pullman strike, which was heating up, as you know, to some terrific violence in Chicago. And George Pullman had created his immense fortune in the railroad business on the backs of vast numbers of immigrant workers, and in a benevolent patriarchal mood had built them a little town, had built them a school, had built them a little theatrical playhouse, and then started dictating what they could do in their cute little village and what they could buy and what plays they could put on. And the workers revolted. So Jane Addams and John Dewey were discussing this, and because of Jane Addams' very progressive political stance, Dewey was sure that she would take the workers' point of view, and he was astonished when she did not. And so Dewey, tried to invoke Hegel to say, well, but this is simply an illustration of what Hegel talked about, the great antagonism swinging back and forth and moving the country forward. And Jane Addams apparently looked him full in the face and said, all antagonisms are unreal, which staggered him. He simply couldn't fathom what she was talking about. And she spoke at great length about the misunderstanding and misinterpretation of Hegel. And what we know, because we don't have Jane's actual words, but what Dewey told his wife that Jane said was that all antagonisms are unreal, because the Hegelian model is not talking about the antagonisms coming together and resolving themselves in a compromise that leads to unity. The antagonisms themselves represent the dynamic inside of unity. This is the picture of how it always is. And the best approach is to comprehend and embrace both sides of the polarity within yourself as an individual. And she immediately invoked the great Shakespearean drama of King Lear and said, what we're seeing between George Pullman and the workers is precisely the same thing, emotionally and psychologically speaking, as what we see in the first act of King Lear, when his daughter Cordelia comes in and challenges him. Both of them, and now we come back to this notion of Hermes and the different gods, both of them are in an archetypal moment. We have a king who is descending in his power. He's on the horizon, slipping below. He's giving away his power. And at that critical kairotic moment for him, what he needs is the seed of his loins to show up on the other horizon, mirroring him with gratitude and affection and honor. What he doesn't realize is that in that self-same moment, Cordelia is rising over her own horizon as a new power and feeling that force in herself, wanting to be recognized by the one who gave her life. Each of them comes with their own agenda and is so filled with their own archetype, they cannot hear the other speak. So what Jane Addams eventually said around this is that all antagonisms are unreal. The only antagonism comes as a result of personal inability to see beyond one's own shadow, which to me is just a staggeringly insightful remark from someone, remember, who's talking about this just after the turn of the century. She hasn't had the privilege of reading all of the psychology that we have for the past 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
And yet her understanding of human nature is so profound that she could also see that history is writ in the conversations between individuals, not in these theories of how things swing back and forth. So I think that's an important thing to bring forward for those who are still caught in this collective consciousness that progress only happens when you throw yourself into a polarity to drag the mass of humanity to your side, which is the equation we're living in right now in this country, as far as I can see.
And the angel goes through the room. You've heard
As
that?
a cool breeze.
That when the silence happens in the conversation, right, an angel is passing through.
Mm-hmm.
Or in ancient Greece, it was that Hermes was passing through. Because it can't be, we're exchanging, but there has to be, I think, those silences that disappear the thought back into the root someplace.
Yes.
So that it incubates a bit and then maybe reveals itself yet again. When you were saying about Hegel, and there is a conversation or perhaps an essay or there's some response that eventually I'd like to give in relation to that dream that the two of you had shared about Hegel.
Oh yeah, that was Rebecca's dream. We were both in it though.
And you understood it immediately when
Yes.
she shared it with you. This guy, Donald Philip Vereen, who's very steeped in Vico, Giambattista Vico, also takes up Hegel. And he's got a beautiful book that talks about when it's moving over to the next phase of thought, Vereen is articulating that what happens in that space, and it doesn't get articulated in how Hegel is being taught. What is the nature of that transition of thought? And he goes in, it's ingenium, the ingenious moment, where, and as you're describing this transition in King Lear, when something, the ruling consciousness is fading and something else is coming in, what is going to be produced cannot be predicted.
That's right.
And there is this moment when Hermes, so to speak, if I would bring what Vereen is saying in this archetypal notion together, where the hermetic aspect of thought goes rummaging, finding what, like the tarot card of death, you see there is a head still, there are feet, there's grass growing, there's going to be things of what has died that are going to be incorporated into the new thing. But what that looks like, you can't predict. It appears like a fractal. And this Jungian analyst in Chicago, when I was living there, John Van Enwyck, if you remember him.
I do.
He wrote a book on chaos theory in Jungian psychology. But he takes a piece from a Sue story that has come up from time to time with the folks I see in therapy, about this issue of holding opposites. You've got a woman, a Sioux Indian mother with her baby. She leaves the teepee, leaves her baby there, goes down to the river to get water, and when she comes back in to her teepee, there is a giant stone woman, and she has the baby in her arms, and she bites a piece out of the baby, and then starts singing, oh little baby, so good to eat, so good to eat. And as she's chanting or singing this, she's rubbing where she's bit, and it's healing. So the woman is trying to decide, if I try to go after her, she's a stone giant woman, I shall be dispatched. If I run, she'll eat my baby. So here is this irreconcilable moment of opposites. What to do? So she says, welcome, grandmother. And the stone giant woman says, I thought you were going to reject me, but since you've welcomed me as family, I must tell you that my husband beat me, and he and his group are seeking you humans to destroy your tribe, and since you've welcomed me, I will show you how to find them and not let this happen, et cetera, et cetera. And so Van Enwick says, this is like chaos theory. You have an initial situation where you start to have these opposites, an initial set of opposites. They start to oscillate. You're not deciding, you're not resolving, you're not polarizing, you're letting them oscillate.
Yes.
If you're married but you find yourself attracted to someone else, you don't act that out, you don't leave the marriage, maybe you hold these things to see what comes of you cooking these fantasies, these differing fantasies. And by holding these things, and it oscillates to a point where suddenly the fractal appears, which is a unique resolution that transcends those opposites, that has never before been seen, because it's out of the living moment or the living initial conditions. So it keeps everything in movement. It's like that to me is what happens there is that moment of Hermes, that ingenious epiphany that only arises when you hold these frickin' opposites that are tearing the culture asunder.
Right.
Where everybody is like, go after him, this and that. And one time in this place where I'm working, there was a situation, and I was going to have to talk to the powers that be, and I felt very like this shouldn't be happening. And I dreamt that night that I was a security guard for a company, a corporation, and Greenpeace was trying to come in. And I woke up and I go, wait. If I compare it to the living situation, I'm the Greenpeace guy. I'm the little guy that needs to be heard, because I'm standing for Eros and for the vitality of this place and the mission of care of souls for the youth and families. And yet the psyche is putting me in the opposite position. And I realized, it came to me because I thought of Van Enwick's book. I was getting polarized. I would have come in polarized. They would have felt and maybe fallen into the field of polarization, the schism, but by going to this opposite side and feeling that perhaps there are times and reasons in which you must protect what is, and by me coming in not polarized, holding these opposites, it allowed them to not polarize with me and find their own feeling and the unique interaction, and we had a resolution that was fine.
Yes. I'm so glad that you remembered that dream and shared it, because that was a dream I told Andrew about.
Oh, yeah?
I said, if you want a perfect example of why it's important to take that concept of bringing the polarities into yourself as an individual, have George tell this dream, because it's such a beautiful example. Because you're right, if you come as one end of a polarity, you're almost asking the other person to fall into the other space. It's like nature creating a vacuum.
God, and it
And
happens
so
so
here,
often.
within the dream, you've accepted responsibility for both sides, and so you can come with that calm Buddhist attitude.
Yes.
So be it, whatever it will be.
If you're a woman and you had your man stolen from you by a woman, that is how the collective psyche would choose to view that situation. Is, oh my God, you were stabbed in the back by this female friend of yours and your man, and they betrayed you and ruined your life by taking away the love that you had.
Right, it's like just adapting the narrative that we have seen in movies and read in books.
Right.
Rather than saying, wow, this thing seems to be happening. What in me helped catalyze a situation in which my nice, contained marriage is being so-called threatened by this new erotic attachment out there?
Yeah.
What part of that is mine? Was I bored with this marital narrative? Rather than simply borrowing wholesale the old script so you can milk it for sympathy, it's not as daring and brave a move as owning your piece in the script, because you can rewrite it at any time then.
Taking responsibility that I left an energy void that sucked these two people to meet because I wasn't fully engaged in the relationship. I was bored.
Could be, or it could be that it's like Jung's dream of the droppings on the church. It could be part of your destiny.
Right.
and this comes along, and you have to take up that
That's right.
that situation. And von Franz in her alchemy book talks. She's teaching, I guess, having lectures with a group, and there are a lot of theologians or priests or pastors, and she takes up, I think it's Hosea having or marrying a prostitute.
Oh, yes.
And
Yes.
so, I don't know if you remember that section, but she's saying, what if you're Hosea in our times, and you get a dream, and dream is saying you go marry this person, marry the prostitute. What do? And so the theologian's saying, well, it's already revealed. You go back. We have these commandments, these things. You make your choices based on what is already revealed. And she goes, I understand that from your point of view, but this path of individuation is that your situation is unique, and you need to go have it out with God. And so maybe active imagination or paint or any sort of creative process where you can get into dialogue about this feeling that you are being asked to go do that by your own eros, or you're feeling called to do it, but you don't want to just act on it, which happened with the fellow who called himself Question Mark, who did all that tragedy in Virginia Tech, where this vision of being the dispatcher, where he inflated with all this power to go kill people, he didn't stop and go, whoa, I'm going to have it out with you. You're asking me to do that? It's in conflict with my virtues. And I'm going to talk to you about it. What is this? Right? And so you don't just act just because the voice or the commandment or the inner thing is coming to you. So she's saying, go have it out. Say, I can't leave my job. I can't leave my marriage. What is that? And then find what the answer is. That is that welcome grandmother thing. You don't quite know what it is, but hold the opposites before you just knee-jerk react, which I think tends to happen too easily, because people don't know their shadow.
Right. In either direction. You either reject
Right.
it wholesale because I'm a good person,
Right.
whatever, or, my God, I've been yearning to do
Yeah.
something like this, and clearly it must be the time because I had that thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what this
either
reminds me
one of them is a naive response rather than holding the extremes, right?
Right.
I think so. I think so.
A bit of a delay, right, to kind of incubate a bit or hash it out if you need to.
But so many people have this. Either you believe so much in the spiritual essence, they go like, "Oh, fate must have conspired to give me just this, so clearly this is my choice."
Right.
And it's lazy. It's
To incubate the tension, to hold the tension, to gestate the tension, reminds me of the magnificent poem by Rilke, in the translation by Robert Bly. It's called The Winged Energy of Delight. And the final lines are, being carried along is not enough. Take your well-disciplined strengths and stretch them between two opposing poles. For inside of human beings is where God learns.
Now, this is an odd, maybe, I'm veering off to a side.
Hermetic detour.
but I think it has perhaps we can feel the connections. I was watching some DVD about, I've been very moved with the colony collapse of the bees and this and that.
Oh, yes.
And there was a beautiful Rudolf Steiner orientation, a group of sort of produced this DVD on the beekeepers, anthroposophical beekeepers, and we're talking about their connection to the bees and the plight of the bees. And at one point in this documentary, they show the queen bee being sort of held in a vice-like structure, her nether orifice being pulled apart by two things that kind of open it, and then the fertilization sort of being imposed upon her in this sort of brightly lit mechanical manner.
Good heavens.
wow. This is nature doing this?
No.
Or this is the beekeepers?
Yeah, no, it's not the anthroposophical beekeepers. They're saying modern science, modern approaches to beekeeping are doing this to reproduce bees. And
Because they're losing the bee
Because of
population.
the loss of the bee population.
and I probably even without the loss of the bee, that this is the way to reproduce bees. We have more.
Do it better. Do
We
it
have
faster.
more productivity.
Let's force
of bees.
them. Let's
Right.
force them to do
Let's do it this way, which
increase productivity.
which is the same thing as IVF.
In vitro fertilization.
And so there is a time and place, of course, for this. But perhaps people move too quickly to it. They want to force, just like we're saying, they want to force a resolution of a schism. It feels to me sometimes, when I just have that image of the queen bee, it's very aggressive.
Yeah, the rape of nature, littéralement.
Yeah.
Whereas you think, the idea of conception, conceiving an idea, just conception, is to I'm going to veer off again, but John Weir Perry, who wrote all about schizophrenia and all of that, talks about, in his time, he formed a group of a place in San Francisco called Diabolus or something, and something like that. But anyway, it was a place where his ideas, the psyche, causes a psychotic break because the ego is too rigid and doesn't work. And so it is dissolving the ego completely. All the libido is descending into the depths where the archetypal images lurk to reconstitute and recreate a new ego. So his place, the people weren't polarized, one up, one down. The staff had a mythological sensitivity. The person who had the break would come in there, not receive any medication, and paint and draw and hear the great myths, because they're producing myths themselves, as you know. Yeah, the sun came down. There was this one guy who I worked with who was psychotic, and he dreamt that the moon came out. He goes, the moon came down and sucked out my head. And I said, lunatic. Lunatic. That's what it means. He just gave me the image of what it is. That's what happens. So he said, create the space where that process can happen. You give them the images that can help them orient themselves, because the myths are organized, right? They're like a large transformer, so the energy can travel through it and reconstitute a new image. Whereas he goes, and then it didn't last. It was in the 70s, and then the funding went away, and then now you have, the person has a psychotic break, they jump in with the pharmaceuticals very quickly. There's a time and place for them. But when it's the knee-jerk and no cultivation of anything, the ego is falling apart. You give them medication, you abort that process. They don't, you got to get them out of the psychiatric hospital, which used to be the asylum where you had containment for as long as you need to go into those depths and allow to fall apart completely.
Yeah.
You're contained there. But
Your
now,
cocoon.
but now you've got the HMOs or Department of Mental Health or what. 3 days.
Stop.
Yeah,
Just
that's
stop.
enough.
No more growth for you.
Stabilize them, give them daily living skills, and send them on the way. But that's aborting the process. So you've patched up the ego that wasn't working in the first place.
Right.
And this father had a dream where he was working with a barbecue grill. He had the propane tank underneath. And as he was trying to cook, there was a problem with the propane tank. And suddenly the thing caught fire. And it caught the whole thing on fire. All of this heated up. He was by the beach on concrete. This thing got so hot, the concrete melted, and the whole piece of equipment went down. And then out in the ocean, a huge explosion happened. And I thought, here is an image that if you don't take up, because he had an anger problem, if you don't take up your anger, if you don't lean into your shadow, your unaware side, you don't cook this stuff properly, then you explode, you hurt your wife, your children suffer. But by having not carried those opposites and done that inner work, you are contributing underneath and out of sight to that collective explosion that will happen. So when we go, it's not necessarily joining Greenpeace or going off and joining some movement.
Perhaps only
If one can deeply hold those opposites and have the courage to peer into your depths and encounter the other within and start to hold these opposites with welcome grandmother, then perhaps you are preventing, at least perhaps, your contribution in a negative
right.
manner to that explosion. Perhaps by you doing it, one person galvanized in that manner can quietly affect an enormous change because they're able to, they
Yes.
accomplished it, which
Yes.
Jesus is probably the most prominent example, holding, the cross and being able to.
Holding the opposites.
That's right.
It seems like it is very difficult for most people to even perceive of holding the opposites. Most people just cling to one, and that's their comfort. That's their source of comfort. So to even touch the other one is scary, and they feel disloyal to their
Collective.
To their collective.
And sometimes I imagine that it appears to be as difficult as being crucified.
Yeah.
Because the ego is so attached to being right, to having the right answer, the right way, the powerful side. To give that up can feel like a crucifixion. Because if your entire identity is riding on that way being the right way, how could you possibly go that far outside your comfort zone to entertain the possibility that the opposing, quote unquote, viewpoint has something to offer you? By the way, I recommend the prosciutto with the melon.
Oh, the melon, of course.
That turns out to be a delicious combination. In fact, maybe I should also put some of the honeydew melon on this plate.
Honeydew would be
even better, I
lovely.
think.
And what do you think?
She recommended the prosciutto.
With melon.
Ah, yes. Yes,
Getting
yes,
the honeydew,
yes.
which is better. Cantaloupe is maybe we let it ripen a little too long. The honeydew is perfect.
Yeah.
It's exactly the most ripe it can be without being.
So, at 26, I was two things coincided. I was going to get married, and I was seeing a Jungian named Vesna Luger in Caracas, and she said to me, "Well, you're scared," and I had another dream of I was working in advertising before I went into psychology, and I dreamt that I saw I was sitting at this desk. I open up the drawer and I see a little cross with Jesus and 4 roses on the corners. And I look at it and I realize I must leave advertising. I get up, I walk to a crossroads, and there is Roland Janice, who was a tremendous boss in advertising with Leo Burnett. And he hugs me and I say I must go. And I told that to Vesna, and she said, it's not that Jesus wanted you to imitate exactly what he was doing, but to take up your cross with the same fidelity that he took up his. And in his case, it was confronting even having to die. And can you follow your individuation process with such loyalty? And then in relation to I was thinking the relationship that I was in was getting serious, and she goes, "You're very scared." And so the combination of that led to me making that painting of. At first I wrote the poem, and then I made this image of Jesus on the cross, and it's called "Alone on the Hill." And it's that the whole poem is sort of leading towards one must go up and confront one's calling and hold opposites and fears. And lean into them if you feel that, and you feel like you've been divinely authorized to walk a path, no matter what it might mean. And so I've often thought about that. It's like you said, you have to have the courage to leave containers. I was very contained in advertising. I was very contained in Venezuela. But it seemed that my path was leading towards a deeper engagement with the psyche, and not a deeper engagement with creating rhetoric that sells a product, but to really help connect and care for the logos of psyche, the speech of psychology, the speech of the psyche. And so all of this wasn't just about getting married, it was about daring to leave everything to go off and take that path up of studying more deeply, which was part of my calling, to hear and listen and articulate the psyche.
To drop your net.
To drop my net, right?
And
Yeah.
be a fisher of
Souls.
of men.
So-
Souls, not of.
You know, this is within the Christian imagination, but it's just an image to some extent. I mean, they're all different paths up. But I know Steiner, we can put this down, you don't have to. Steiner talks about that in the, Rudolf Steiner talks about there was the old law, which is sort of Abraham's law, where everyone was known and valued by bloodline. But with the appearance of Jesus, it was now a new ethic. It was a new, you are part of a community based on your affiliation through love, through this individual connection with the Spirit. So I gathered those ideas up because I think it is the issue of the time. It's the schism problem. It is the issue. And however you want to approach it, it's really about how can you become aware of these opposites by confronting where it hits your psyche, not up in the head in academic conversation, but where is all of this showing up in your psyche emotionally, keeping it all in movement, feeling the epiphanies of that inner authorization, and through love, but a very conscious, discerning love that's very connected to darkness, to depth. It's not, but you know, and then you start to feel that oneness through our common humanity. But it's not insisting on that monotheistic or bloodline. You're one of us, or you're not one of our group based on blood, or anything literal. I'm part of the APA. I'm part of the, you know, whatever academic realm of thought I'm identifying. None of that. In the end, it's about that individual encounter, that inner authorization. And my final thought.
Your spiritual essence, who you are.
Yes. And on this sort of thread of conversation, Edinger, in his book on Apocalypse, talks about are groups that are gathered because a person is carrying the projection of the self, which is what you were describing earlier. And there is another formation of group where the self, the Godhead, the living God within, brings each individual's connections, orchestrates a group, which I see in Silverado, you know, the movie with Brian Dennehy and these other, Kevin Costner and all of that, where the four, by circumstance it seems, all suddenly are riding together. It wasn't that their ego sought that out. It was, you could say, the self or the living God within each of them brought them together. Or King Arthur in the Knights of the Grail.
Or even the Lord of the Rings, the
Or-
fellowship
yes.
that comes together, brought because of the propitious moment.
And authorized from something very deep.
Called. Individually called, yes.
So that is what one wants to try to watch for, right? When that authorization happens and when it releases. So that you don't get caught with something that's become too rigid, and then the God has to you know, let one loose on top of the roof of the church. You know?
As many people, I think many church leaders are dealing with this right now, not just some of the churches I'm familiar with, but many of the churches in the world today are in decline, are losing numbers and are shrinking, and they don't know how to deal with shrinkage because they're not used to it. They're used to growth, and it's like, oh, what do we do when we only have 5 members to support this huge building now?
You drive through LA and in Glendale, but there are all these Masonic Lodge buildings, and they're extraordinary. But they were built at a time where I think there was this, I was thinking when there was community, there was a sense of community. Now it's all falling away. As a magician, I learned through a mentor, through this fellow Scott Hollingsworth, and I had a crush on his wife. I was 9, and he, this booming charismatic voice, and it had all of that anima, all that particularity of imagination and unique eros between us, and now many learned from DVDs. And now the Masonic lodges, which arose out of a living sense of community, it's no longer that sense of citizenship and community is falling away in local communities, where you can get up and move to another community like that, so you don't put down roots.
Right.
And there's a tremendous loss.
Yes. Yeah. Because if you don't stay long enough to invest in the community, and the community is not invested in you, it's a vicious cycle that no one then is willing to extend themselves in that, mutual reciprocity system that has kept so many cultures alive for so long. It is a terrible loss.
And it seems very dark. It seems to threaten the stability of society itself. There are other aspects of this online world that I'm sure will show their brightness and their beauty, and like ways that actually online connection are enhancing civilization in ways that we're not even quite aware of yet. But there's definitely a shift. It's hard to not call it a loss of this one great sense of personal living community. I mean, virtual reality is virtual, and it is not.
It doesn't feed the body or the soul in the same way.
Right.
And did you notice that we started our conversation almost extolling the virtues of schism? That it's important, that it's necessary. And now we seem to have shifted and moved over to the place of some of the bodily sorrow and sadness and longing that exists in a world torn by schisms, that we feel the separation very acutely and yearn for something that we imagine could be, should be, might have been, might still be. But in these polarities, and again, I mean, this conversation is taking place the summer of 2015, and we have another political election coming up next year, so we're in the throes of that agony. But what I have sensed, and what I've even felt in myself, are those knee-jerk reactions. When you look at things happening and you say, that's not me. I would never say that, do that, be that, go there. That's not me. And you see it from the other side. The rejection of, a socialist, that's not me. And I represent America, so that's not us. And so everybody rejecting what appears to be beyond their comfort zone. So I've tried to make a practice of just saying, okay, some aspect of that is me, by virtue of my being in this country. Some part of that is me.
Sure.
What part of that is me? And this is a very frightening process.
Yeah.
What part of me would take a gun and go into a church where I was invited to sit with people in communion and then pull out a gun and shoot them? What part of me would do that? I mean, this is a very terrifying exercise. It's, like Jung's descent into his own personal hell. Doing things, hanging out with people you would never imagine yourself being or doing. And yet, to heal a schism as huge as what we have in this country, some form of holding the little tensions wherever we can seems to be necessary. But what I feel, what I sense, and partly coming from Chicago, Barack Obama's homeland, it feels as if he has catalyzed an enormous amount of shit from the underworld. Because the assault to the white male ego in the South must be unbelievable.
Interesting.
Just incredibly painful. That the highest titled figure in the land, and to alienate him even more, the insistence that he's not really American, that in fact he's not even Christian, he must be a Muslim. Anything possible to demonize
Evidence
and
aside.
alienate him. He's not me. He can't represent me. It's too different. And yet Obama, in his person, is someone who contains the energy, which is astonishing to me and anyone who has seen how much garbage gets thrown at him. But because he can contain it, it means that it's having to cook its way deeper into the country. The very fact that killing a black man by a policeman is now news is really news for the psyche. Because for how many decades was that not even newsworthy? But now it is. Now it's on the radar. We are now collectively conscious of what we are doing. That our hate killings are basically pulling out 1/5 of an entire race in this country on a daily basis.
Lee Roloff. He helped form the Jung Institute, or the Jungian community in South Africa during the time of apartheid and all of that. And he came back and he gave me a poster that had a white Afrikaner and a black Afrikaner. And one had their arms around the other from behind, and they were smiling at the camera. And then it's that quote by Jung that goes something like, "And what if I was to find that," I'm making it up, but it's the essence of it. What if one was to find that the thief, the I don't know, the murderer, the criminal, the whatever, the other was within me? What then? Because it's so easy when you project it out, make somebody else a scapegoat or another group the scapegoat. But when you have to go, if that, like you were saying, is within me, I can't expel it. It where does it go? It's part of my psyche. And I need to take up some relation and hear what this is, who this is, what they want. Oftentimes in your psyche, you have that thief, or the burglar, or the menacing other trying to break into your home, which is this image of how we resist the new, the strange, the foreign. One time I had like an extraterrestrial reach in through a window. All I saw was the arm, and the arm came in, and you really realize if we're sitting here and suddenly an alien arm actually reaches over from outside on the balcony into our living real, not Men in Black movie world, but in our living reality, this foreign alien comes reaching in. I mean, why did you come to disturb us?
Yes.
And then I go into
Because it changes everything.
I go into this
changes
giant
everything.
fireplace, and inside the fireplace is an inner room. You know, and I'm in there. And so you think, again, once you encounter that, again, it's a call to go within and cook and make yourself maybe the fuel itself, you know, burn in there. Get in touch with what is descending too. It's not just going up. It's maybe not even Santa. There's that Jung quote, if the ego, something like, if the ego is inadequately prepared, and the Godhead descends, it comes into a straw hut and everything goes up. Which would be like that guy who called himself question mark in Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
As opposed to being a tabernacle that can hold the descent of the God. And instead of making the God reduced to this small ego-serving something, which doesn't work really, because then it sneaks up and possesses you, the Godhead. How can you make yourself the proper receptacle so that the God can, or the gods can descend and work their manifestation within your humanity, including all the dark sides? Because again, like if we use the Greek myths, they're not necessarily bad, any pathology of any god. Don Slaggy, a Jungian here in LA, he often refers to a thing in von Franz, C.G. Jung's A Myth of Our Time, where you see the you know, the Catholic Church did the doctrine of the Assumption of Mary.
Yes.
And there's an alchemical image where you see that coronation of Mary in heaven, taking her place up with the Trinity, but underneath is being pulled up a sort of hermetic monstrosity. And Slaggy says, as all of this is going up, now comes, we must make conscious all that mixture of darkness, of power, of all that, the repressed stuff, and take it up consciously. And that's the task of our time.
Yes. And what, of course, is marvelous is when the bishops decided that they must allow Mary this place in the divine Godhead, they were still talking about Mary, the pure and virgin. They didn't realize that they were inviting the goddess. And of course, the goddess comes with the serpents and the earth and the blood and the dripping heads and the maimed, unarmed limbs and the dead children. And it's the whole works, honey. You don't get to pick and choose. Once you let the goddess in, she's in. And that is a perfect image to represent what is happening. Yes. So chaos will be unloosed. It has begun.
And it is our job now to hold these polar opposites. What is the socialist within? What is the capitalist, hardcore CEO of major 500 company raping other countries' resources to make a profit?
Right.
What is the Hillary Clinton within? The Barack Obama within? The Donald Trump within?
Right. Who is the Confederate flag-waving, gallant Southern gentleman who has just lost everything he held dear? We haven't seen the end of this. And you know who's going to be able to pick this up, if they're wise enough, are the women. Because they're going to recognize that something has absented itself from the masculine in this country. And it's everything that the South was holding up. The good old boys. You know where the word gallant comes from? That's straight out of the troubadour poetry. The gallant South. That's a troubadour image. So some part of that piece of the psyche has been held by the Southern men. So that shift, that dramatic breaking and placing of their emblems into the rag and bone shop and detritus of the heart is going to have profound consequences in terms of the relationships between the sexes, I think.
Yeah, and if it's not repaired in some fashion, the feminine spirit will start dominating the entire culture, which you think, women say, well, it's about time, we've been oppressed for thousands of years, but there's gore there's carnage on all sides.
Right.
When these polarities are not in some form of balance.
And the woman has to step up to the plate and say, the gallant is in me. I am not merely the recipient of gallantry. I must be the purveyor. I must be the producer of the valiant and the gallant and the honorable and the courteous in those deep mythological meanings of those words. Otherwise, the imbalance is simply going to flip into some other arena. Yeah. It's a tension. There are opposites there. And we've held them apart by creating gendered divisions.
Do you remember at the Archetypal Festival in Notre Dame when Robert Bly was reading some poem? And he finished and he goes, I'm going to read it again because we haven't grieved enough.
Oh, yes.
And he read it a second time. I later met a young man, he was in his 30s at the time, who wrote the book Imaginal Memory in the Place of Hiroshima. And he takes up this old tradition of the art of memory. He's trying to say that happened and we cannot forget. We need to keep the images of horror, of the consequences of the bomb in memory, because by giving the dead there a place in our memory, they remember and remind us and produce an ethical stance. As an aside, Steiner has I think you pronounce it Steiner, but that the real community of humanity includes the dead and the unborn.
Yes.
And I so resonate with that. How often I feel that the spirit of my father, I've had the smell of roses show up at very essential moments. And you have the sense that the others are looking on and watching and maybe even participating. But it's part of the larger community and the unborn coming along too. So this guy, Michael Perelman, who wrote this book, is saying, for example, you have a burning bus. That the image is a burning bus of children. Your first reaction is to go save the children. Well, what if you imagine that it's already happened? There's nothing to be done. You can't save the children. You can have the fantasy of going into saving, but in the end, they're already images, or what the idola, which were the shades. It's the Greek word for where we get image and idea. So if we have images and ideas, those are the dead, or the shades in the underworld, which I've always, Hillman is the one I think of. So they are already in the underworld of memory. and you can't save them. What then happens if you cannot heal or save or be heroic in the face of a very moving image? In the art of memory, this classical notion of the practice of putting images in memory said you need to have stirring images like sexual images or comical images or shocking images. So nightmares are more vivid because they're trying to stir your soul. So here's a shocking image of burning children. And what happens when you contemplate the image? Just like the monks in the Middle Ages had to contemplate the Stations of the Cross. Because by doing that, it's awakening soul qualities of compassion, of grief, of lamentation. And to link it with the feminine, it was the women who, in that connection to Hecate, the goddess of the underworld, they would la 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 la, or grieve, and it would be all this screaming and all of this, and then the church prohibited it, and the priests then had to conduct the grieving process, but they took it away from the women. I think this time, if you put all of this hermetically together, there is a time and place for activism. But I think what's not happening enough is that ability to enter lamentation when you can't fix it. Because by leaning into the horror of any of the tragedies that are going on, and you just have to live with it, feel it, as it burns and aches in your soul, it awakens a quality of compassion. You just start to, the tears are what I think. That's why I think Bly said we haven't grieved enough. When you haven't grieved enough, you don't get in touch with the heart that is the place where the river flows, where you can get to healing. But when you're angry and you're not feeling that, then you can go and kick some ass with someone, take them out because they deserve it. And you're just repeating the cycle. But when you go, I can't, what if you can't fix it? You can't. It's done. And then just fall into that pain and have that inner feminine do the grieving yells. And the tears come. And we're all in the underworld together. Then the qualities that unite us, that I think are Dionysian, right? They start to, we feel communion together again.
Yes.
And then it's none of that knee-jerk,
That's right.
my position, I'm going to attack your positions, with which the politicians, by and large, must do to distinguish themselves, because they're taking on advertising strategies. You have to position your brand.
Right.
But what about just... speaking
and in a sense,
the living spirit.
That is the only alternative to the crucifixion or the holding of the tensions, is to move into grief.
And
that is where you go.
My dear friend, this Jungian analyst, Don Slaggy, talks about the Stabat Mater, the standing mother. Whereas you could say Jesus, he gets to die and resurrect. Whereas in her moment, her task is to see the horror of this unfair, unjust, terrible death of her son and all that love she feels, and stay frickin' standing.
That's right.
She must
To
stay
take it in.
standing and witness it, which is sort of like, there's an image, a poetic image that I'm blanking on the poet, that the Greek mask of theater, the eyes always remain open. You must look at the tragedy and take it in, and not quickly react to the counter reaction to try to remove it, because if I kick your ass afterwards, then I've removed the problem. But I don't have to sink into the pain of the thing and then enter the grief and the lamentation. So her standing, if you listen to Pergolesi and hear the Stabat Mater classical music, that entering of this capacity to lament is so incredibly healing. And how often in a therapy moment, I cannot fix what's happened.
Right.
Mother has lost 3 children to the oddest circumstances, and the client is one surviving son. How the task is to lean in and help her stay standing. And that is through crying and compassion and lament, the song of lamentation. And then through that, which I think to some extent is a holding of opposites too, the new fractal appears, the new life, the new possibilities, but it's far more human and compassionate.
it's humus and humorous, and the best funerals always end in a good laugh.
Yeah.
Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
That's the way.
Yeah.
A real
Then we are
good
human.
funeral.
Yeah.
It is. My closing thought is an image from Brother David Stendhal-Rast. He said, we think of people pulling in different directions and the pain it causes. He said, imagine that you're standing outside of a barn and you're looking through a window and you see two lines of people, and one line is moving to the east and one line is moving to the west, and you think, how sad. They're just going in opposite directions. But you get closer to the window and you stand on tiptoes and you peek in and you realize that in fact everyone is holding hands. They're standing in a circle and dancing. And it was only your limited perspective that made it seem as if they were moving different directions. That's the mystic's answer.
And that they're dancing.
And they're dancing, which is the movement after grief. Y'all get up and dance. Mm-hmm.
My thought is around, was it David Bohm who wrote on dialogue? There's something about soulful, open-minded conversation that isn't seeking to resolve anything, but is simply seeking to make connections and share in a sense of community, a communion with, say, here tonight, inviting beauty and sort of like Bacchus, Demeter, Aphrodite to join us. So we stay in our body and we stay close to those three that will invite Eros into our midst, along with his beloved Psyche. Those kinds of conversations are becoming so rare. I've heard it put by, I think, Linda Sussman, who writes a book called Speech and the Grail. There's a living truth in any moment. It's shifting, but it's the Grail. How to hear the appearance of the Grail and what the Grail is saying, how to listen that deeply, how to respond, how to speak that speech that's appearing. That would be the essence of conversation. And may more of these kinds of conversations that are unstructured, unplanned, not to save the world in a Promethean fantasy, but simply conversations that serve care of the soul by listening deeply to what's being asked of us and bringing our humanity in emotion and imagination to the response.
And George, I would like to toast you on that note.
Into dinner with Andrew.
And here's to Dionysus. Here.